We are starting a new series today, as you can tell by the slide. So the series is Underdog, and we're going to be kind of taking a look at, well, we're going through the story of Gideon, but we're going to be kind of looking at it from the perspective a little bit of kind of baseball. You know, it's baseball season, someone told me, and it's going to be, I'm a huge fan. I've already bought like 2 or 3 books to read for the series about baseball. But so yeah, we're going to be talking about Underdog and the idea of how God can use you even in your weakness, right? So it's really easy to be like, well, that's easy for him. He's the pastor. They're a missionary, whatever it may be. Like, you're like, I'm just a regular person, and I'm messed up, and I've got all this stuff going on in my life. And that sums up the character of Gideon. And so we're going to be really looking at that and how by just his simple obedience, sometimes reluctant obedience, okay? Like, I don't know how. He figured out somehow a way to drag like 5 feet, it feels like. Sometimes God was calling him to do things. But he was obedient even when, and this is great. There were times just straight up where Gideon was like, I have zero faith, but I'm going to do it anyways just to be obedient. I don't have any faith, God, so do what you can with this situation, but I will be obedient. And then, of course, we'll see how that built his faith. But speaking of Underdog, I want to tell a quick story about a baseball player from the 90s. His name is Jim Elliott. Any baseball players here? Or baseball fans, I should say? Okay. All right. Does anyone remember Jim Elliott? Is anyone okay? He was from the 90s. It was like 89 to 97, I believe. 97, 98, something like that. He, as you can see from the pictures, he was born without his right hand. I mean, how many here would think that if you're born without a hand, that baseball is probably something that's not a career option for you? Like, I would have raised my hand and said yes. But he was determined to play baseball. That's what he wanted to do. So he, by literal definition, was an underdog. There's no reason he should have been able to play baseball. And he got picked on and made fun of this as a kid, you know, and so he actually got into sports as a reason to fit in more. Personally, and this is like the underdog mentality, personally, I would have thought it'd been the opposite. I'm like, all right, God, I'm feeling called to something not with sports because I was born with it. You clearly didn't want me to. I was born without a right hand. I'm going to be a public speaker. I'm going to be a writer. It might take me a little bit longer or something, but hey, you write with, if you're not typing, write with one hand. I'm going to something. What is it? Something I can do? And he instead said, no, I'm going to do sports. It was a way for him to get involved and kind of get over that perceived handicap and and make friends. But because he knew that he was missing a hand and he knew that he had a disadvantage, he worked harder. And so he worked harder at sports than any of the friends that he grew up with and eventually made it into the major leagues for a good amount of time. And it's funny, people targeted him as a weak spot in the team. And so what would happen, so he was a pitcher, and when he was in the outfield, they would purposely bunt towards him because they knew, they're like, oh, he's missing a hand. He's got the glove. There's no way he's going to be able to get it. We'll have an easy run. And what he would do, and he almost never missed him, what he would do is he would have to tuck his glove into his arm, pull out his good hand, and to be able to get the ball, to be able to throw the ball after catching it. And so it was this weird, like, he came up with this system where he could be able to throw, put it back in, catch, pull it back out, his hand back out, opposite of what I'm doing, because I am right-handed, so I'm using my right hand as an example, and then be able to throw the ball. And they tried, team after team after team, tried to take advantage of that, and it almost never worked. He was able to compensate for that because of his determination. So we're going to jump in and look at a character who's actually kind of the opposite of Jim Elliott, to be honest, and looking at Israel in a time of the nation's history where they are the opposite. They do not represent. They are an underdog, but they don't have that underdog spirit, as it were. They have a victim, a defeated spirit, and a defeated mentality. So we're going to pick up in Judges 6, starting at verse 1, and read the 6, okay? So it says, and the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Midians 7 years. And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel. And because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made them the dens which are in the mountains and the caves and strongholds. And it was when Israel had sown that the Midianites came up, and the Amalekites and the children of the east, even they came up against them. Verse 4. And they encamped against them and destroyed the increase of the earth, till thou come into Gaza, and left no substance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor donkey. For they came up with their cattle and their tents, and they came as grasshoppers for multitude for both they and their camels were without number, and they entered into the land to destroy it. And Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites. And the children of the Lord cried out to the Lord. Children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Okay, so this is the part, like, I'm going to be honest. Growing up, this is the part of each news story I skipped, because it's all the boring stuff, lots of words, no action, no plot yet. It's all just a bunch of, like, stuff going on. And so when I started kind of studying for this series, I'm like, okay, Gideon, we're going to talk about Gideon, and, go. And I was like, wait a minute, there's this whole section on here. There's so much in here in these 6 scriptures that are so easy to skip right over, and that we really need to spend some time. First off, I want to cover a couple of things. So the Midianites, they're talking about how the Midianites were the main, the Amalekites, others, but the Midianites were the main ones. So fun fact, the Midianites and the Israelites were actually cousins. Did you know that? So this is after Sarah died and Abraham remarried. They became the Midianites. And then another kid became Amalekites. So anyways, they had gone off and they totally went a different direction, and they became wicked nations. And Israel was actually supposed to clear out that whole land. It was given to them as the promised land, and they were supposed to come through and take what God had given to them, and they disobeyed. They didn't do it. They kind of did a half job, okay? Anyone have any teenage? No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to go that direction. But they did a half job, right? And they kind of tried, and they put in some effort, and they got some early victory, and they were like, okay, this is good enough. We're happy. And they didn't finish it. And so it came back to get them later. So at this point in time, not only had they not finished the job, but they're being completely defeated. And the Midianites have surrounded them. They've taken everything, and they're kind of like living as refugees in their own country. In fact, it talks about how they're hiding in caves, and they're hiding in just different areas. They're not even living out in the regular areas. That'd be like here, like you come into Ely, and you're like, well, where is everybody? Well, they're all living down in the mines. Like, well, why? Well, because the Midianites, it's not really worth it to them to like go and try to track them down in the mines, and so they just wait, and anytime they come out of the mines and they plant something, and as soon as there's a harvest, they come and they steal what they need, and whatever's left over, they just burn. And it's easier for them that way. And that's another thing, is there was so much hatred and so much persecution that they weren't just thieves, right? So even that, at least, it's like, oh, okay, they're coming in, they're stealing, like they have their own perspective, and maybe they're providing for their families. They would take what they needed, and they're like, oh, well, this is all we can load up in the back of the car. We don't have anything else left. They would then just like, okay, well, burn it all, get rid of it all. Oh, kill the animals and let it spoil. They hated the Israelites, and the Israelites, that last verse says, they were greatly impoverished. So they were literally refugees in their own country, hiding in the hills. And so that's how this story starts. And that's where we see them. And when I was reading this, it really struck me that, sometimes as the body of Christ, we can find ourselves in a similar situation where we're just kind of living our lives, and when we're not really reading the full word and we're not really having our guard up, we can have these enemies that come up against us. And if we're not careful, if we don't have a defense, we can find ourselves spiritually impoverished. And sometimes it can even bleed over, and it can be physically, it can be our health, it can be numerous different things. It can be our relationships and our families. And we can find ourselves, much like the Israelites, impoverished because of the enemy. And I just want to spend this first week really talking about this idea of like, okay, the rest of the story is Gideon and what they're doing, but it starts off with they had to make the decision to fight. They had to make the decision to come out of the caves and stand up for themselves and stand up for their God, for their nation, for their families, for their livelihood. And that was the first step. They had to get to a point where they were so impoverished, they finally said, okay, enough is enough, and they cried out to God.